The engineers from the Hudson's Bay Company stood in front of Mikhail Petrov's cabin and shook their heads. It was October 1879, and they'd been sent to inspect the structures at the new trading post in northern Manitoba. They'd examined the company warehouse, the factor's residence, the storage sheds, all built according to company specifications, all approved. Then they'd come to Mikhail's cabin, and everything they knew about construction told them this building shouldn't exist. It violated every principle of proper building. The walls leaned inward at impossible angles. The roof seemed to float on top without proper support. The whole structure looked like it might collapse if someone sneezed too hard. The lead engineer, a stern Scotsman named Duncan MacLeod, pointed at the walls. "These walls are going to fail," he said flatly. "They're not vertical. They're under tremendous stress. When the weight of winter snow hits that roof, the whole thing will pancake. You need to tear this down and build properly before someone gets killed." Mikhail Petrov, a Russian immigrant who'd arrived at the post 6 months earlier, smiled politely. "I understand your concern," he said in heavily accented English, "but the cabin will stand. It is built using techniques from my homeland, very old techniques, very proven." MacLeod was not impressed. "I don't care what they do in Russia. This is Canada. We have building standards. This structure is unsafe, and I'm recommending it be condemned." The other trappers and traders at the post had said similar things when Mikhail was building. They'd warned him the walls would collapse during construction. They'd predicted the roof would fall in. They'd told him he was wasting his time and materials on a structure that would never work. Mikhail had thanked them for their concern and kept building. He knew something they didn't. He'd grown up in northern Russia, in a region where winters made Manitoba look mild. He'd learned construction techniques that had kept people alive for centuries in conditions that would kill anyone relying on conventional building methods. His cabin looked strange because it was designed to do things conventional cabins couldn't do, and the true test was coming. December brought the first serious cold. Temperatures dropped to -20 and the conventional cabins at the post began showing problems. Chinking between logs froze and cracked. Doors warped and wouldn't close properly. Interior moisture froze on walls. The structures groaned and creaked as the wood contracted in the cold. Mikhail's cabin showed none of these problems. The walls, which had looked so precarious in October, stood solid. The interior stayed remarkably warm. The structure was silent, not groaning like the conventional cabins. The other traders noticed, but most attributed it to luck or temporary conditions. "Wait until the real cold arrives," they said. "Then we'll see if that Russian contraption holds up." The real cold arrived on January 7th, 1880. A massive Arctic high-pressure system settled over the region and didn't move for 9 days. The temperature dropped to -38 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there. For 9 consecutive days, the thermometer never rose above -35. The wind was minimal, which was the only mercy. At -38 with wind, nothing would have survived. But even in still air, this was killing cold. This was cold that froze metal so brittle it shattered. Cold that made trees explode as sap froze and expanded. Cold that could kill an exposed human in under 30 minutes. This was the test, the 9-day cold snap that would determine which structures were built right and which were accidents waiting to happen. The conventional cabins suffered immediately. Log walls contracted dramatically in the extreme cold. Gaps opened between logs despite the chinking. Cold air poured in. The cabins became impossible to heat adequately. Men burned firewood at unsustainable rates, feeding their stoves constantly, and still the interior temperatures hovered around freezing. Ice formed on interior walls from condensed breath and moisture. Several cabins developed serious structural problems. One cabin's ridgepole cracked from the stress of contraction. Another cabin's corner notching failed, causing one wall to partially separate from the others. A third cabin's door frame contracted so much the door wouldn't close, leaving a 1/4-inch gap around the entire perimeter. The occupants stuffed blankets in the gap and huddled by their stoves, burning through their winter's wood supply at an alarming rate. The Hudson's Bay Company warehouse developed a catastrophic problem on day 4. The roof, built with green lumber that hadn't been properly seasoned, contracted unevenly. The stress caused a main support beam to crack along its length. The company factor, terrified the entire roof would collapse and destroy thousands of dollars of trade goods, ordered the warehouse evacuated. Men worked in shifts through the brutal cold, moving furs, supplies, and trade goods to other buildings. 2 men got frostbite during the operation. The beam held, barely, but the warehouse was deemed unsafe until repairs could be made in spring. The company's flagship building, constructed by professional builders according to official specifications, had nearly failed. Mikhail Petrov's cabin, the one everyone said would collapse, stood without a single problem. The interior stayed warm, comfortable even, with a fraction of the wood other cabins consumed. The walls showed no cracking, no separation, no stress. The structure was silent and stable. On day 6 of the cold snap, when the other buildings were groaning and cracking, when men were desperate for any relief from the cold, Mikhail invited several neighbors into his cabin. They came in from the -38-degree cold and stood in shock. The interior was warm, not just survivable, actually warm. Mikhail sat comfortably in a single layer of wool clothing. The walls radiated gentle heat. There was no frost on any interior surface. The small fire in the stove was barely burning. "How is this possible?" they asked. Mikhail explained as he had before, but now they were finally ready to listen. The key to Mikhail's cabin was its construction method, completely foreign to Canadian builders but ancient in northern Russia. The structure was what Russians called an izba, but not the simple log cabin Westerners associated with that term. This was a sophisticated evolution of the izba, incorporating techniques developed over centuries in the harshest climate inhabited by humans. The design addressed every weakness of conventional log construction and optimized for extreme cold weather performance. But it looked so strange to Western eyes that engineers couldn't believe it would work. They were judging based on appearance and preconceptions rather than understanding the underlying principles. The first unusual feature was the wall construction. Mikhail hadn't used conventional horizontal log stacking. Instead, he'd set logs vertically, buried 3 feet deep in a trench, creating a palisade-style wall. This vertical placement meant the logs couldn't separate from each other the way horizontal logs could. There were no horizontal joints to open up from wood contraction. Each log was a continuous piece from below ground to the roof line. The gaps between vertical logs were filled not with simple chinking, but with a complex mixture of moss, clay, and animal hair, packed tightly and then covered with split wooden strips on both sides. This created a triple-layer wall: log, insulation, wood facing. The total wall thickness was about 14 inches, far thicker than conventional cabins. But the really unusual part was that the logs weren't standing straight vertical. They leaned inward at about a 10-degree angle. This was what had alarmed the engineers. Surely leaning walls would collapse, but Mikhail had designed it precisely this way. The inward lean meant the roof weight pressed the walls together rather than trying to push them outward. The walls were under compression, which wood handles beautifully. There was no outward thrust to resist, no tendency for walls to bow outward, no structural weakness. The angled walls were actually stronger than vertical walls would have been. This was an ancient principle used in many Russian northern buildings, but it looked wrong to people trained in conventional Western construction. The second unusual feature was the roof system. Mikhail had built a double roof with a 2-foot air gap between the layers. The lower roof, just above the living space, was made from split logs laid flat and tightly fitted. Over this went layers of birch bark for moisture protection. Then came the air gap, maintained by a framework of crossbeams. Then came the upper roof, also split logs with more birch bark, and finally a thick layer of sod. This double roof with air gap was a massive insulator. The air gap trapped heat like a thermos bottle. Rising warm air from the cabin heated the lower roof and the air gap, but very little heat reached the upper roof. Snow piling on the upper roof provided additional insulation. The entire roof system probably had an insulation value equivalent to R30 or better. For comparison, the conventional cabin roofs had values of maybe R5. The third unusual feature was the floor system. Mikhail had dug down 2 feet and filled the excavation with layers of sand, then clay, then more sand, compacting each layer. Over this base went split logs, then birch bark, then a finish floor of smooth planks. This multi-layer floor provided insulation from the frozen ground below. The compacted layers prevented frost heave and moisture infiltration. The air gaps between layers trapped heat. Most conventional cabins had simple plank floors laid directly on sleeper logs at ground level, providing minimal insulation from below. Cold radiated up through these floors constantly. Mikhail's floor system blocked this cold penetration. The fourth unusual feature was the heat system. Mikhail had built what Russians called a pech, a massive masonry stove quite different from the cast iron stoves the other cabins used. The pech was built from stone and clay, forming a structure about 4 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 7 feet tall. It sat against the back wall but extended significantly into the room. The interior contained a complex maze of channels through which hot smoke passed before exiting through the chimney. This channeling meant the smoke gave up most of its heat to the stone mass before exiting. The entire structure became a giant radiator. A fire burned for 2 to 3 hours would heat the stone mass, which would then radiate heat for 12 to 18 hours. The pech needed firing only once or twice per day, yet it kept the cabin warm around the clock. The cast iron stoves in other cabins provided heat only while actively burning wood, requiring constant feeding. The fifth unusual feature was the entrance design. Mikhail had built a double-door entry with a small enclosed porch, creating an airlock. You entered the porch, closed the outer door, then opened the inner door. This prevented cold air from rushing directly into the living space. The porch also served as a cold storage area and a place to remove outdoor clothing before entering the warm interior. Most conventional cabins had a single door opening directly into the living area. Every time that door opened, cold air flooded in and warm air rushed out. Over the course of a winter, this heat loss was enormous. Mikhail's airlock design eliminated it almost entirely. The sixth unusual feature was the window design. Mikhail had only 2 small windows, both on the south wall and both equipped with interior shutters that were closed at night and during extreme cold. The windows themselves were double-glazed, 2 layers of glass with an air gap between them. Double glazing was virtually unknown in 1879 frontier construction. Mikhail had made his own by carefully mounting 2 panes in a thick wooden frame with precise spacing. This primitive double glazing dramatically reduced heat loss through the glass. During the day, winter sun through the south windows provided free heat. At night, the shutters closed, preventing heat loss. This passive solar design combined with good insulation meant the windows were net heat gainers over a winter day-night cycle. If you're amazed by this engineering that everyone dismissed as impossible, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We're uncovering construction wisdom that was mocked by experts, but survived conditions that destroyed modern buildings. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next episode. All these features work together to create a structure with exceptional thermal performance. But there was one more critical element: airtightness combined with controlled ventilation. Mikhail's cabin was much more airtight than conventional construction. The vertical logs with their triple-layer wall system, the multi-layer floor, the double roof, the airlock entrance, all minimized uncontrolled air infiltration. But Mikhail hadn't sealed the cabin completely. That would have caused moisture and air quality problems. Instead, he'd incorporated small ventilation ports that could be opened or closed as needed. These ports were positioned to create natural convection when open. Cool, fresh air entered low on one side, warm, stale air exited high on the opposite side. This allowed air exchange without massive heat loss. The combination of extreme insulation, massive thermal mass in the pech, minimal air infiltration, and controlled ventilation created a structure that maintained comfortable interior temperatures with minimal energy input. During the 9-day cold snap, while other cabins struggled to stay above freezing despite constant fires, Mikhail's cabin maintained 55 to 60 degrees with just 2 fires per day. The difference wasn't just comfort, it was survival. The other trappers were exhausting themselves cutting and hauling wood, burning through their winter supplies at unsustainable rates, getting inadequate sleep because they had to tend fires all night, and still being dangerously cold. Mikhail was comfortable, well-rested, and burning perhaps 1/10 the firewood. He could sustain this through the entire winter without depleting his wood supply or exhausting himself. The structural performance was equally impressive. The conventional cabins were groaning, cracking, and in some cases failing structurally. The extreme cold caused massive contraction in the wood. Conventional horizontal log cabins are particularly vulnerable to this because each log can move independently. When they all contract, gaps open. When they expand unevenly, stress builds up. Mikhail's vertical log design eliminated these problems. The logs couldn't separate from each other. The compression from the roof weight actually increased as the logs contracted, making the structure tighter rather than looser. The inward-leaning walls converted roof load into compressive force that strengthened the wall structure. There was no opportunity for the structural failures seen in the conventional cabins. On the 9th day, the cold snap finally broke. The temperature rose to -20, which felt almost warm by comparison. The Hudson's Bay Company took stock of the damage. The warehouse needed major repairs. 3 cabins required significant reconstruction. Wood consumption had been 3 times the normal rate. 2 men had serious frostbite. Morale was shattered. The company factor wrote in his report that the post had barely survived the cold snap and was not adequately prepared for extreme conditions. He recommended significant investment in improved structures for the following year. Duncan MacLeod, the engineer who'd condemned Mikhail's cabin in October, came to see the Russian. He was a proud man and the admission was difficult, but he was also honest enough to acknowledge when he'd been wrong. "Your cabin performed better than any structure at this post," he said. "I was wrong to condemn it. I'd like to understand how it works so I can incorporate these principles into future company buildings." Mikhail was gracious. He explained the design again, this time with MacLeod, listening carefully and taking notes. They spent several hours going through each feature, why it was built that way, what purpose it served, how it contributed to overall performance. MacLeod was particularly interested in the pech. The Hudson's Bay Company imported cast iron stoves from England at great expense. These stoves were inefficient, burning huge amounts of wood for mediocre heat output. A pech could be built from local materials at minimal cost and performed far better. MacLeod asked Mikhail to help design masonry stoves for the company buildings. Mikhail agreed. Over the next few months, they designed and built 3 pech-style masonry stoves for the main company buildings. The performance improvement was dramatic. Wood consumption dropped by over 60% while interior comfort improved. The company accountants were delighted. The cost savings in firewood alone paid for the masonry stove construction within 1 winter. The wall design was harder to retrofit into existing buildings, but new construction could incorporate the principles. MacLeod designed a hybrid system using conventional horizontal logs, but with much better insulation, an air gap in the wall system, and better sealing. He couldn't convince company management to approve the inward-leaning walls. They looked too strange, but he incorporated the other principles. The next generation of company buildings performed much better than the previous ones, though still not as well as Mikhail's cabin. The vertical log design with inward lean was too radical for institutional acceptance, but the underlying principles of heavy insulation, thermal mass, air tightness with controlled ventilation, and passive solar orientation gradually influenced company construction standards. Other trappers and traders at the post asked Mikhail to help them build cabins using his methods. Over the next 2 years, Mikhail supervised or advised on construction of 6 cabins, incorporating Russian building techniques. Not all were full recreations of his design. Some were hybrids, adapting his principles to conventional formats, but all performed significantly better than standard construction. The men who lived in these cabins became advocates, telling other trappers at rendezvous and trading meets about the superior performance. The knowledge spread slowly through the northern trading networks, but there was resistance. Many trappers and traders couldn't accept that Russian building methods were superior to British or American techniques. National pride was at stake. Surely Western civilization with its advanced technology must have better building methods than backward Russia? This assumption was wrong, but it was deeply ingrained. Some people would rather suffer in inadequate shelters built the proper way than admit that foreigners knew something they didn't. This wasn't universal. Plenty of pragmatic men adopted the better methods, but it was common enough to slow the spread of knowledge. There was also the issue of construction skill and effort. Mikhail's methods required more upfront work than conventional cabin building. Setting vertical logs required digging a trench and carefully placing each log. Building a pech required masonry skills and patience. Creating the double roof system was time-consuming. Many trappers wanted the quickest possible shelter so they could get back to trapping. They'd build the minimal adequate cabin in 2 weeks, rather than spending 6 weeks building a far superior one. This short-term thinking meant they'd suffer all winter in an inadequate cabin and burn 3 times as much wood, but the upfront effort seemed more salient than the long-term payoff. The building knowledge Mikhail brought from Russia was part of a centuries-long tradition. Northern Russia has one of the harshest inhabited climates on Earth. Winters in Siberia regularly reach -50 degrees or colder. Traditional Russian builders had been refining cold-weather construction techniques for over 1,000 years. Every generation learned what worked and what didn't through harsh experience. The survivors passed on the knowledge. Over centuries, this produced highly sophisticated building systems optimized for extreme cold. The izba, in its evolved forms, represented the accumulated wisdom of this long tradition. It wasn't primitive or backward. It was actually more advanced than Western frontier. Construction in terms of thermal performance and structural resilience in extreme cold. Western builders, moving into the northern frontier in the 1800s, brought building traditions from much milder climates. Their techniques worked adequately in temperate regions but were marginal in extreme cold. They were rediscovering, through trial and error, lessons that Russian builders had learned centuries earlier. When someone like Mikhail appeared with knowledge from that long tradition, he could shortcut centuries of painful learning, but only if people were willing to listen and learn from foreign sources. National and cultural prejudice often prevented this knowledge transfer. People had to suffer enough in their own inadequate buildings before they'd seriously consider learning from other traditions. Mikhail Petrov stayed at the Hudson's Bay post for 6 more years until 1886, then moved to a homestead further south. His original cabin remained in use by successive occupants until 1912, 33 years after construction. When it was finally abandoned, it was still structurally sound. The vertical logs were solid. The walls were tight. The pech still worked. The building didn't fail. It was simply no longer needed as the trading post declined. Some of the logs were salvaged for other construction, but most of the structure was left to slowly return to the earth. By 1920, it was gone, reclaimed by the forest. But the knowledge had spread. Dozens of trappers and traders had learned Russian building techniques from Mikhail or from others he'd taught. That knowledge continued to be applied in scattered locations across the northern frontier. The principles Mikhail used are now understood by modern building science. Vertical log construction eliminates the weak horizontal joints of conventional log buildings. Inward-leaning walls under compression are structurally more stable than vertical walls under mixed loading. Thick, multi-layer walls with air gaps provide superior insulation. Masonry heaters with tortuous smoke paths extract maximum heat from wood fuel. Airtightness combined with controlled ventilation optimizes indoor air quality while minimizing heat loss. Passive solar orientation and thermal mass stabilize interior temperatures. All of these principles are recognized in contemporary sustainable building design. But in 1879, they seemed strange and wrong to Western builders because they were unfamiliar. The 9-day cold snap at -38 degrees was the objective test that proved Mikhail's methods superior. The conventional cabins groaned, cracked, and nearly collapsed. The company warehouse almost lost its roof. Men suffered from cold despite burning enormous amounts of wood. Mikhail's cabin stood solid, silent, and comfortable. This wasn't opinion or tradition. This was measurable, observable, undeniable performance difference under the most extreme conditions.
Yet even with this proof, adoption was limited. Some people learned and benefited. Others clung to familiar methods despite their obvious inadequacy. This pattern of resistance to proven superior alternatives is frustratingly common throughout history. Modern earth-sheltered homes, super-insulated houses, and passive solar designs use the same principles Mikhail employed: heavy insulation, airtightness, thermal mass, controlled ventilation, passive solar gain. These create structures that maintain comfortable temperatures with minimal energy input. Contemporary building codes and standards are slowly catching up to what traditional builders in harsh climates knew centuries ago. The passive house standard, developed in Germany, essentially codifies principles that Russian, Scandinavian, and other cold climate builders had been using for generations. We're rediscovering that the old ways, dismissed as primitive, were actually sophisticated solutions to difficult problems. Before we conclude, I want to ask you to subscribe if you haven't already. We're bringing back building knowledge that was condemned by experts, but proved superior when tested by reality. Your support keeps us researching these forgotten methods. Hit that subscribe button now. The engineers who said Mikhail's cabin would collapse were working from incomplete understanding. They knew Western building codes and conventions. They didn't know the physics principles underlying those conventions or the alternative approaches developed by other building traditions. When they saw walls leaning inward, they assumed structural failure was imminent because that's not how Western buildings work. They didn't understand that the inward lean was a deliberate design feature that converted dead load to compressive force, actually strengthening the structure. Their expertise, real within its domain, was limited by cultural and educational boundaries. They couldn't recognize superior engineering because it didn't fit their framework. This is a recurring problem in many fields. Experts develop deep knowledge within a particular tradition or paradigm. They become very good at working within that framework, but they can lose the ability to evaluate alternatives that exist outside it. They dismiss things that don't fit their model, not because those things are inferior, but because they're different. True expertise requires not just deep knowledge of one approach, but enough humility and breadth to recognize when alternative approaches might be superior. The engineers who condemned Mikhail's cabin lacked this breadth. Duncan MacLeod, to his credit, was able to update his understanding when presented with undeniable evidence. Many experts never manage this. The trappers and traders who mocked Mikhail's cabin made a similar mistake. They assumed that because the structure looked strange, it must be poorly built. They judged based on surface appearance rather than understanding underlying function. This is natural human behavior. We use mental shortcuts to evaluate things quickly. Does it look like good construction? Does it match our template of what a good cabin should be? If not, we dismiss it. These shortcuts work reasonably well most of the time, but they fail when evaluating genuinely innovative approaches. Innovation, almost by definition, doesn't match existing templates. It looks strange. If we automatically dismiss things that look strange, we'll never recognize superior innovations. The lesson from Mikhail's cabin is that we should evaluate based on performance, not appearance. Does it work? That's the only question that ultimately matters. Mikhail's cabin looked strange, but it worked better than anything else at the post. That performance difference should have ended the debate. Instead, it took a 9-day crisis at -38 degrees for people to seriously reconsider their assumptions. Most people won't change their beliefs until reality forces them to. The crisis provided undeniable evidence that couldn't be ignored or rationalized away. The conventional cabins were failing. The weird Russian cabin was thriving. This performance gap was too large to dismiss. Ideally, we wouldn't need crisis to recognize better methods. We'd evaluate objectively, test fairly, and adopt what works best regardless of how strange it looks or where it comes from. But humans don't work that way. We're tribal. We trust our own culture's methods. We're skeptical of foreign approaches. We value familiarity and conformity. These biases serve social cohesion, but they impede technical progress. Overcoming them requires conscious effort, open-mindedness, and willingness to test assumptions. The people who learned from Mikhail, who set aside their preconceptions and evaluated his methods fairly, benefited enormously. Those who clung to conventional approaches suffered unnecessarily. The cabin that everyone said would collapse stood solid for 33 years. It withstood countless storms, extreme cold snaps, and the test of time. It outlasted many conventionally built structures that were deemed proper and approved. It kept its occupants warm and safe through winters that tested the limits of human endurance. And it did all this using techniques that Western experts said were impossible and dangerous. The cabin's survival and superior performance weren't luck. They were the result of applying time-tested principles developed by people who'd been building in extreme cold for centuries. Mikhail knew his cabin would stand because the principles were proven. Everyone else thought it would collapse because the principles were unfamiliar. This gap between knowledge and belief, between what works and what people think should work, appears throughout history. The best solutions often come from unexpected sources and look strange to conventional eyes. The experts often get it wrong because they're trapped in paradigms that exclude superior alternatives, and crisis often serves as the teacher that forces people to confront reality and abandon cherished beliefs that don't work. Mikhail Petrov's cabin taught all these lessons to anyone willing to learn. Some learned, many didn't. But the cabin stood, solid and warm, through 9 days at -38 degrees and 3 decades beyond. A testament to the value of ancient knowledge, the danger of dismissing what we don't understand, and the ultimate authority of performance over prejudice.